Hey, this is C&D Chow. I'm Chris. This is MMA For You. I'm going to be doing an MMA Q&A today. I got 3 questions here going on. I might actually do a Q&A every month now, especially when there's a lot of these weeks with no big MMA cards. I'll give out some shout outs here. We got Rick 1982. Happy birthday, by the way. It was I know it's a couple of days ago. Vegeta DTX, Justin Brunson. I heard you in a Illegal Elbows that podcast. Good job there. Burnman 23, always keeping me on my toes. Carnius 797. Haven't been playing that many RPGs lately, unfortunately. Been pretty busy. Fruity McGee, Cyberplex, Perfect Machine TV. Mark William, Zazano 85, Florentino Ariza, Fight Freak, Chris Spack, Kevin Spacey, The Last Time Lord 2, and Trey MMA. Okay, let's just get started. So Steve from Wisconsin asked, what is your take on the Eddie Alvarez situation in Bellator? And his follow-up question, what do you think of Bellator because of the situation? I mean, as a fight fan, it sucks for me not to see Eddie Alvarez in the UFC. I think it's unfortunate that I think the trial hearing or something like that won't even happen until 2014. So I mean, he's in a really bad situation. He's in litigation with Viacom and Bellator. I'm gonna be perfectly honest with you though. I don't sympathize with him as much as others do. As a fight fan, yeah, it sucks. And I'm a fan of the guy, but as far as the situation, I can't sympathize with him too much just because I remember in MMA fighting, if the guy, they were saying on the round table, one of the guys was saying, if he resigns with Bellator, this guy's going to get a $200,000 signing bonus, and his contract is $70K to show, $70K to win. So I can't really say poor Eddie Alvarez because he's gonna make a lot of money whether he stays with Bellator or not, or goes with the UFC. I mean, Bellator doesn't do pay-per-view, so I don't even know how you can really match, how they can match the possible pay-per-view points that Eddie Alvarez would have gotten if he signed with the UFC. Obviously, the UFC's bigger. He'll probably get better sponsorships there. I think a lot of people, I mean, the thing is, and with the Bellator situation, and what I think of Bellator, I think Bellator actually gets a lot of unnecessary hate, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, it's not a good situation and not a good look for them. I mean, it really is the big bad corporation versus the underdog. People always go with the underdog going against this big bad Viacom, trying to keep them away from fighting, doing shady tactics and whatnot. So I mean, it does suck to hear what's happening to him. I know he sold an investment property to pay for this litigation. So, I mean, it does suck to hear, and it sucks as a fight fan not to see him fight, not to see him fight in the UFC. If I'm Bellator, looking at it from a business perspective, if I'm Bellator, I'm doing everything I can to keep Eddie Alvarez, He was a name before he went to Bellator, but obviously, considering that the UFC wants him and the situation that he's in right now, it looks like he became a bigger star, an even bigger star because of Bellator. He was already pretty well known even before Bellator, but I think Bellator probably took him a little farther now. He's definitely entrenched in the top 10 of the lightweight division. What I think of Bellator, the situation, like I said, from a business perspective, they're keeping their talent, they're keeping the better employees. I don't really, from a business perspective, I don't really see what the issue is Is it kind of shady? I don't know. It's within their rights, you know. And Eddie Alvarez, from what I heard, was getting paid handsomely fighting in Bellator. I think some fans are just over the top with the reaction. I mean, I remember one guy even going so far as saying like Bellator is the child porn of MMA, and he pretty much has to like wash his hands, if you know, clean out his eyes if he watches the product. I'm like, what the? You know. Some people I've had like big arguments with them. It's like, and this situation kind of devolves into everything else about Bellator. You know, it's like, oh, look what they're doing to Eddie Alvarez. You know, and then if you see the same, some people comment on like what Bellator is just doing in general. It's like, Pat Curran wants to try boxing, and Bellator is going to let him. Oh, some people are like, oh, what the hell is wrong with this company? I'm like, what do you mean? They're letting their employee stay happy. I don't really understand what the issue is here, you know? They're signing all these ex-UFC guys, you know? And they said, that, like, they wouldn't do that. I'm like, yeah, well, the landscape of MMA is changing. There's a lot of good and some crappy guys, but good talent coming out of the UFC. So you got like a Paul Sass, a Diego Nunes. Those guys are still prospects, whether they're in the UFC or not. They're still relatively young. I mean, Diego Nunes not so much, but he's still a good fighter. And if King Mo gets on the market or Rampage Jackson gets on the market, yeah, of course you're gonna snatch these guys up. Of course you're gonna push them to the moon. They're much bigger stars. In two divisions that are very weak. They're light heavyweight division and heavyweight division, because Rampage wants to fight in heavyweight, is really weak. Of course you're going to push guys like that. Especially since they also have that like TNA crossover thing. Obviously they have something with Viacom as well, you know? It's just their investments, and they're, high level, high priced investments, you know? Yeah, you do want to push guys like that to the moon because, they're relatively known commodities, especially Rampage, a very much known commodity. I've had arguments with people saying like, oh, Bellator isn't the second best MMA organization, or else they're not as far ahead as people like to think. I'm like, yeah, like World Series of Fighting or the Resurrection Fighting Alliance isn't that far away from them. Once again, it's this idea. The problem is this Eddie Alvarez situation made people not like Bellator, and sometimes I see a trickle down effect that then it becomes like about the product itself. It's a child porn of MMA apparently. Or like the fighters, they kind of suck. It's like, haven't we learned from the WEC and Strikeforce that like guys outside of the UFC can be very high level and can easily fight in the UFC? I mean, there's definitely a weird trickle down effect. They'll see something like this, or maybe it was just building. I know a lot of people don't like Bjorn Rebney, and this was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, and like. Everyone hates on Bellator. It's the thing to do is to hate on Bellator. Some of the stuff I hear is like ridiculous. I remember one person was saying like that Bellator isn't number 2 because they're nothing more than a glorified regional promotion. Because one reason is because their prelims feature regional talent, and I'm like, well, yeah. And the prelims are on like Spike.com. It's like no one's really watching, the prelims that much. They're not a big factor, and they don't really affect the product that much. You'll get like a Calvin Tiller. I think David Rickles came from the prelims. I mean, you'll get some guys out of the prelims, and other guys are just like some local guy that kind of sucks, which is fine because you want to get the local guys to get the live audience. I mean, really. You can't really ignore that they're on a bigger platform than most MMA organizations outside the UFC. Being on Spike TV is huge. That's undeniable. That's one reason why they're number 2. They've been there. They've just been around for a long time. They're backed by Bellator or Viacom. You can't really deny that they're like the number 2 situation. Whether or not you like them or not, I don't really know why you deny the talent they have. The product is really good. I mean, if you watch a Bellator card, there is, a main card, generally you'll see a lot of cool finishes. You'll see a lot of young guys, Russian prospects, guys you never heard of that these guys seem to unearth, and usually they have entertaining fights. I mean, the card with King Mo where he got knocked out, I mean, every fight pretty much on that card, I think even the prelims, almost every fight was a finish, and most of them were some insane knockout. I think Lima knocked out like Brian Baker on that card. What else? I mean, it's just like insane knockouts, You definitely see finishes that you normally don't see in Bellator. I'm not so down on Bellator because of the Eddie Alvarez situation, obviously. I think, like I said, it kind of sucks, but I do think that there are a small contingent of MMA fans that know the situation, that find Bellator to be this vile, corrupt company. And to even go farther with Bellator, a lot of people ask, well, what's the repercussions of this, the Eddie Alvarez situation? Is it going to have lower viewership? The new time slots are going to lower the viewership. I'm going to be honest, I don't think as many people as some would think actually follow this situation. It really is a very hardcore niche MMA fan that's really following the situation and have all this vitriol towards Bellator. Will prospects sign with Bellator because of this situation? Yes. We already saw Will Brooks sign with them. Bubba Jenkins has just signed with them as well. I mean, the fact of the matter is, these Bellator tournaments, I mean, you get paid like in the tens of thousands just for fighting in the tournament. I think it's something like, it's like $15,000 for your first fight in the tournament, and then if it's an eight-man tournament, then the next one is like 30, and the next one's finally, that's how it equals out to 100,000 or something like that. They're arbitrary numbers. So I mean, there are guys, say like a Sergio Pettis or something, that probably wouldn't need to sign with Bellator. He's headed to Bellator, or he's headed to the UFC. He probably doesn't need to sign with Bellator. A guy like a David Rickles, who's no one's heard of, really unknown, really didn't make this huge splash in the regional scene, will probably sign with Bellator and probably get paid a lot more fighting in Bellator and get more name recognition. I mean, who's Frodo Hospolayev or like Shamilat, Shamilayev, before Bellator, I didn't know who Andrei Koreshkov is or Tiger Sarnovsky, and I'm sure they're getting paid a lot more in Bellator than in shows in Eastern Europe, so yeah, I think more prospects will sign with Bellator. They probably make, because, you gotta go where the money is, fighting from what I read, even in fighting in the UFC, guys have to have a day job, they don't get, their purse does not really pay for training and nutrition and whatnot, from what I read. And that's in the UFC level for some guys. Yeah, I gotta wonder, people outside the UFC. Yeah, you see the money that Bellator could get you in a short amount of time. That's the thing. You can make tens of thousands, if not 100,000, if you win a tournament. Fighting for what, like 4 months? yeah, some guys are going to take that instead of fighting in the regional scene and get paid peanuts. So, yeah, do I think it will affect their getting prospects? Probably not, to be honest. Money. People will go where the money is. MMA outside the UFC, isn't exactly the most lucrative thing for a fighter. It's, So, yeah, I think they'll sign certain prospects. I think certain really high-level prospects or really well-known prospects. Lance Palmer's another one. Probably won't sign with Bellator. Lance Palmer, Sergio Pettis, 1 or 2 fights. If not now, if they're not already making deals with the UFC already, those two will probably get signed to the UFC. But they're like blue chip. The blue chip prospects, no, won't sign with Bellator. But others, a lot of others probably will. Okay, next fight. Next question after that, Jay Munchin asks, what do you think is the ceiling for World Series of Fighting? It's kind of sad. I like what World Series of Fighting is doing. They're offering paycheck. In general, I'm of the opinion, and pro wrestling is like this as well. The more organizations that you have, the more possibilities you have for fighters to apply their trade and to make money. That's the big thing. World Series of Fighting is a good thing because guys who get cut from the UFC in general, and a few prospects here and there, Justin Gaethje and whatnot, Marlon Moraes, can make money off World Series of Fighting. It's a good organization. The ceiling, they're kind of just battling for like second best. It seems like that's where they want to be, and I guess that's not a bad thing. But the only problem is I can't see the business formula working. I really can't. The fact of the matter is, I would assume that a guy like a John Fitch, or just a former UFC guy, I'm sure David Brands or Josh Berkman, costs a lot more to sign than a prospect. I think that one of the things with World Series of Fighting is that while it is admirable that they're signing former UFC guys, I think their selection of these former UFC guys that they sign isn't always the best. I think at least that's what I find different with Bellator signing former UFC guys. Granted, they got some guys like a Marcus Davis or like even a Mike Guyman, but like with Bellator, it seems like there's some form of rhyme or reason to who they sign as far as former Zuffa or UFC guys. And like I said, even go with Marcus Davis. He's a name that some people would recognize, but he's beatable for the new guys. Like if he fights at welterweight, and Douglas Lima could probably smoke the guy. Or like a Brent Weidman. That'd be a good name to have in your resume as a fighter. And guys like Rampage, King Mo, or like a guy like a Diego Nunes, or even War Machine. There's a lot of the guys that they sign seem to bring something to the table. Whether they're slaughters to the lamb, or slaughters to the lamb, or well, I just said that wrong. I'm sorry. Some sacrificial lambs. Oh my God. To be slaughtered. They could be like sacrificial lambs to be slaughtered. They could just have some form of guys with name value. Some guys that are still growing as prospects. Diego Nunes, Paul Sass. Geez, I'm missing one. Some guys with high name value like King Mo and whatnot. King Mo and Rampage. With World Series of Fighting, they'll get like a Tyson Griffin, good signing. But then they'll get like some really middling guys too. Like, no offense to David Branch, but it's like, dude, the guy's like the most middling like fighter out there. He's just a middle. I'm not trying to offend him or anything. I'm just using him as an example because they signed kind of like these middle tier former UFC guys, and it's like, here's my thing. They're former UFC guys, so I'm gonna assume that they cost more money than the prospect. But two, if they're just middling fighters, then like I doubt they really move the needle in the sense of like viewership or whatnot. I doubt that like some of these guys are even like a Jacob Volkman. I don't know if he's moving the needle. It's like, oh, I gotta watch World Series of Fighting now because Jacob Volkman's on the card, or like John Gunderson's on the card, or Dan Lozon, David Branch, Branch is gonna be in the middleweight tournament, but like some of these guys, it's just kind of like, okay, well, yeah, like I said, you're not really moving the needle for anything, and since you have the former UFC fighter label, I'm sure you get paid more than your prospects. That's why I don't think the business side or that method of business will really work for World Series of Fighting. There's definitely a disproportionate the number of former UFC guys or former Zuffa guys versus the number of prospects is definitely disproportionate. They definitely have more former UFC guys than prospects. Bellator, on the other hand, even though it's kind of changing, it's kind of shifting, I still think that there's still more prospects than there are former UFC guys. And then that's mainly the main card guys. On the prelims, you'll see a guy like a Mike Guyman or Steve Steinbeis that used to fight in the UFC. But like, I'm talking mainly like the main guys that tend to fight in the tournaments, or the guys that tend to be on the main card. The numbers kind of shifting with Bellator. It's obvious that they are signing more former UFC guys, but for the most part, Pat Curran, Ben Askren, and Michael Chandler are still like Bellator guys. They're like their main guys. I'm sure they're not signing former UFC guys to out those guys or anything like that. And if anything, those guys can probably beat most of the guys that Bellator signed that are former UFC guys. So yeah, as far as signing for World Series, they are on NBC Sports. They're on a pretty big a relatively big network. I don't know how invested they are in World Series of Fighting. Whereas Viacom owns Bellator pretty much. I don't think NBC Sports owns World Series of Fighting. I don't know if they have that much interest in MMA as, say, Viacom to Bellator. I don't know. One thing is, I don't have any hard facts. All of this is speculation on my part. But I'm assuming that they're paying guys a lot more, and I can't really see much of a return investment. Like talking about like the World Series fight, like let's just another example, like with the prelims. Okay, you put like Gunderson versus Dan Lozon. Well, the fact of the matter is, if those guys are getting paid more, this is all assuming, by the way, than your normal prospect, and they're stuck on your prelims, they're not moving the needle at all. So you're paying these guys to fight on your prelims but I just don't see how that's really helping the product. If you have prospects on your prelims, that makes a little more sense. They're not getting paid as much. Most likely, they're not getting paid as much. And, eventually these prospects can turn into, these guys on prelims can become main card fighters. and they're not getting paid as much. You know, they're not moving the needle, but they're not supposed to move the needle at this moment. You know, as far as getting viewership. Once you build a guy up, then you can move him on main card and start promoting a guy like a Marlon Moraes or Justin Gaethje, who are they, or Tyrone Sponge, they are promoting as far as like prospects in World Series of Fighting. But when you're putting a lot of former UFC guys on the undercard, it's like, what are you doing as far as a business model goes? You know, I mean, they're not moving the needle. They're not going to get me more viewership. Yet you're going to pay these guys, assumingly, you're going to pay these guys more than, than a prospect that could eventually be like a homegrown fighter or something like that. And that's another thing with World Series of Fighting too. Is like, you don't get an impression. Like, Josh Berkman has got a resurgence in World Series of Fighting. Do I really see him as a WSOF fighter? Like a World Series of Fighting fighter? No, I see him as a former UFC guy. And having that type of distinction, it's important, because with Bellator, I see Michael Chandler, Ben Askren, Pat Curran as Bellator guys. You know, I put there's like a value to that, and which in turn adds value to that name. You know, you're building the brand. With them, the brand doesn't. It seems like the UFC, minor leagues. That's what the brand is to me. Like I said, it's not a bad thing per se. It's good what they're doing for the fighters. As far as the question goes, what's the ceiling for them? I just don't know how long that can last. I don't see a great big ceiling for them, to be perfectly honest. And they just seem like that organization where guys go to get back into the UFC. Why should I care about certain guys if they fight 3 times in World Series Fighting and they go to the UFC? Okay, why should I care about these guys? You're not giving me reason to watch World Series of Fighting or stick with it, because you're signing these guys, he gets so many fights, he goes back to the UFC. Well, I'm going to follow them into the UFC. I'm not going to keep watching World Series of Fighting, because of that. So yeah, I don't see it. I don't know how long it's going to last, to be perfectly honest. I like what they're doing. I personally don't think the business model is going to work, to be perfectly honest with you. Okay, and the final question I have. Okay, M Girl asks, do you think that Invicta FC will be bought out by the UFC? And our follow-up question is, what do you think of women's MMA in general so far? Do I think Invicta FC will be bought out by the UFC? Eventually. Anytime soon? Probably not. I think a lot of people get kind of the wrong idea about Invicta and the UFC sometimes. It's kind of for example, I think Espinoza from Showtime. He's one of the head guys in Showtime. I forgot his first name. He was saying that they're thinking of maybe having Invicta FC on Showtime. Well, and then it's you're gonna compete with the UFC now. It's well, yes and no. I mean, the UFC has one female weight division at 135 pounds. Whereas Invicta has 105, 115, 125, 135, and 145. So, the thing with Invicta is they don't necessarily. They do compete because they are MMA, but at the same time, it's solely women's MMA with weight divisions that the UFC doesn't have. So in a way, yeah, I guess they compete because they are on pay-per-view, and it is pay-per-view dollars spent. But otherwise, it is very much a different product in itself too, because it's women's MMA. It does have a cult following right now, and Shannon Knapp and the fighters have done a great job as far as building interest in the product and building brand loyalty. I am huge on Invicta FC myself. Every card has delivered. I think maybe in the future it would be bought out. I don't think anytime soon. I think Invicta will probably find a TV deal and stay around for a while. I mean, they're like one of the only like all women's, mixed martial arts organizations out there. So yeah, I just don't, and they are making strides in the MMA landscape. So it's really hard for me to say. I don't think they'll be bought out by the UFC anytime soon. It might actually be, and if they do, I don't think it'll be like this really bad thing anyways. Hopefully Shannon Knapp will still be the head of the organization, and they do their own thing, unless the UFC takes all the women's divisions or something like that. I mean, they already have a lot of weight divisions as it is. So I don't know if they're gonna take, and I know they're thinking about taking a 115 weight division sometime in the future, but see, and that's the thing. Do I think Invicta will be bought out by the UFC? Well, what does that entail? Does that mean bringing in their talent into the UFC and make all these weight divisions, or just make Invicta FC a separate thing too? I don't know what a buyout would actually entail. Do they just let them go out of business? I mean, what are we talking about here too? And I don't even know, I would assume that if the UFC bought out Invicta, that they just let Invicta do what they normally do, but have the Zuffa name behind it. Maybe it'll even help them get a deal with Fox or something like that, and be on Fox Sports 1 or Fox Sports 2 or something like that. Who knows? As far as the follow-up question goes, what do you think of women's MMA in general so far? I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, one thing that's really cool about women's MMA, and especially it being the UFC, is how MMA fans and UFC fans have taken women's MMA very well into the UFC. Whereas, you can't really say that about boxing. Boxing fans, don't necessarily take in women's boxing the same way as men's MMA fans have in general. I mean, there's some guys that just won't watch women's MMA, but for the most part, it's widely accepted. I mean, that's the thing. Obviously, there's gonna have some people that just hate it still, but for the most part, it looks like it has been very much accepted into the fold and into the UFC. That's the thing too. I mean, the worst women's fight in the UFC that's happened so far is Rosie Sexton versus Alexis Davis, and even then, I mean, the standard for women's MMA fights are so high now that even then, that was a good fight. There was nothing wrong with that fight. It was still a good fight. It wasn't a great fight like Tate versus Zingano was, or even Rousey versus Carmouche was. And I think there's just really high expectations with women's fights to all be above average, all action, all violence. And that's McMahon versus Gaff, where she kept punching her in the face. Crucifix, punch her in the face, stoppage there. Just really violent stuff that you see from women's mixed martial arts. Miesha Tate getting kneed in the face by Kat Zingano 5 times and then elbowed. That's some pretty violent stuff, and I think there's some really big expectations from women's MMA. I mean, the fact that like some people really looked down upon Davis versus Sexton, it was a good fight. It just wasn't as great as some of the other fights that happened. The very few women's fights that have happened in the UFC so far. You know, it's just not it's not as good as those, but it was still a good fight. Invicta FC is making a lot of strides in women's MMA. I know XFC is going to have a main event with some women's fights. I think it's like Eggink versus Magana, if I'm not mistaken. You know, so it's, I mean, what I think so far, it's really good. It's definitely getting up there as far as recognition is concerned. I know SFL had the first women's main event with Ritika Singh versus Irene Cabello even. So you're definitely seeing more of a shift with women's MMA. The fighters, their placement on the card and whatnot. It's no small thanks to like Ronda Rousey, the UFC, and Invicta FC. You know, I mean, they're really bringing it to the forefront. I mean, it's trending along really well. It's almost surprising. I remember as a MMA Fighting Roundtable where they were just surprised about like, wow, like this is really, it's kind of taking off. You know, a lot of people were surprised about how just accepted it was. It can only really get bigger, to be honest, too. You know what I mean? Wouldn't, you know, if I were to pick like what weight division, or what female weight division that I'd like to see next in the UFC, it'd be 115. I mean, got Tesha Torres, Rose Namajunas. I mean, she's getting really popular right now. She's only had 2 MMA fights. Her flying armbar was really cool. She's girlfriend of Pat Barry, but she's getting like a fan following, and she's relatively new to MMA. Joan Calderwood has a big fan following right now, and she's awesome. I think she's the next Invicta FC champion. You got Carla Esparza, Beck Hyatt's really popular. You know, so you know, it wouldn't surprise me to see the UFC actually get another women's weight division sometime in the near or far future. It's definitely an untapped market in the sense, just because like I think there is definitely capability of making stars from female fighters. Not just like, you know, like Gina Carano was around, Cyborg, and now Ronda Rousey. You know, I mean, there's definitely potential for stars in what's a generally still an relatively untapped market in the sense. I mean, Invicta FC is like the only women's MMA organization that I really know about that's really, you know, bringing women's MMA to the forefront. So yeah, I mean, I think I just think it's doing great. I'm looking forward to like Jessica Andrade fighting Liz Carmouche. I think Jermaine Durandamy versus Julie Kedzie is going to be a cool stand-up fight. I'm looking forward to Invicta FC. You know, it's going really good. I'll even go so far as to say that I think some of the fighters from Invicta FC could be relatively big stars in the UFC. Michelle Waterson, here's the thing, and Ronda Rousey has it too. My formula for like to make a star that like drives pay-per-view buys or viewership is always this. It's looks, talent, and a unique charisma that draws fans to this fighter. And Ronda Rousey has it. I think a lot of fighters in Invicta would have that, to be honest with you. A lot of them have the looks. To be perfectly candid with you, some of these female MMA fighters, are quite honestly pretty attractive. So you definitely have the looks quotient there, as it is, in a male-dominated sport. Where most of the fans are male fans. That already would have it so people would tune in. Skill-wise, the skill's not always there. That's the problem, because the skill in women's mixed martial arts is still really low. Not really low, but like you can definitely tell sloppiness. I think the stand-up is actually, and striking is where women's MMA is still really weak as far as skill goes. A lot of female fighters, I guess, to use a sexist term, I guess, it's like they punch like girls. You know what I mean? You can kind of see it. That it's really not. It's really not polished technique. I mean, there's some female fighters like Sarah Kaufman, Marlos Kunin, Joan Calderwood. It's getting better. I mean, you're getting like Tesha Torres. She has a kickboxing background. Rosa Namajunas has some kickboxing as well, if I'm not mistaken. But in general, the striking really needs to go, isn't up to par yet. Grappling wise, though, it's really good. You are seeing former Olympians in women's mixed martial arts. A lot of high level Brazilian jiu-jitsu female fighters get, Alexis Davis is a jiu-jitsu black belt. Rosie Sixton's a jiu-jitsu brown belt, for example. You definitely get to see good grappling. Jessica Penne versus Michelle Watterson was, I thought, a really good grappling battle. It's very different, just because they're lighter weight. So, like, you see a lot more flexibility and whatnot, a lot more scrambling and whatnot, but you still see high level grappling with them. But striking wise, it's still not there. But I see that improving. Like I said, it wouldn't surprise me. Holly Holm, she's coming to women's MMA right now. Would not surprise me to see more Muay Thai and kickboxing champions. Duda Yankovic and Miriam Nakamoto. I mean, they're fighting each other. They're high level strikers, female strikers. They started their MMA career. Don't have too many fights yet. Jermaine Durandamy, she's really high level as well. So, I mean, you're definitely seeing a shift. You're seeing more high level, like, female boxers, Muay Thai fighters, kickboxers, getting into women's mixed martial arts. So, I think we're going to start seeing more of a shift there in the striking eventually. I think we'll just see higher level athletes, female athletes, eventually get into the UFC as well. There's money there. I mean, seriously, Rousey's probably making a lot of money. There's exposure there. There's season, the next season of The Ultimate Fighter is going to be men and women with 2 female coaches. So obviously, I mean, they're making great strides right now. I'm really looking forward to seeing where women's MMA goes in the near future and the far future. I don't think it's just a fad. I think initially when they brought in women's mixed martial arts to the UFC that they just wanted Rousey. I'm thinking that they are seeing that as a product by itself, it is sustainable and it probably does get viewership. That it, in a sense, belongs in the UFC with or without Rousey, to be perfectly honest with you. I'm hoping that's what they see. And it seems like it, it seems like it. So, yeah. So, I expect good things from women's mixed martial arts in the future. Okay, yeah, that's pretty much it for this Q&A. Thank you for all the subscribers and whatnot. If you have any comments, just leave them below. And that's it for MMA For You. Thank you guys very much.